Awesome. Welcome everyone to the Friday Tech Talk at the Tech Academy. My name is Kenzie and we are joined this week by Chris Ling, who is going to be discussing tech interviews. So Chris graduated from the Tech Academy in 2017 and has been worked as a software engineer at Vacasa and a data engineer at Flux and now Facebook. And before that, he was a lawyer. So he has lots of different interview experiences and is going to be sharing with us what he's learned, tons of resources, and I will be able to share the slideshow with you. Towards the end of the talk, I'll put my email in the chat box. I'll put it in now and I'll put it in at the end too for anyone that joins us late. And feel free to reach out to me and I can send all those resources along. And with that, I'm going to let Chris take it away. Welcome, Chris.
All right, thank you. I'm going to go and try to share screen and hopefully not blow everything up. All right, share. Can everybody see my deck? I'm going to assume that's a yes.
We can see it.
Yes.
Cool. All right. So yeah. The title of this presentation is Tech Interviews Office Hours, and that's because I actually since last October have been running an office hour series, kind of based off of the tech interview related mentorship, mock interviewing, and otherwise volunteering that I've been doing really since close to the start of when I went into the software engineering industry. So who am I? I am a former lawyer who became a software engineer thanks to the Tech Academy. I started in February of 2017. I quit my job and went full-time, graduated May of that year, and had my first job, I believe, right before August at Vacasa as a full-stack engineer working on data products. And that involves sort of the machine learning and otherwise data modeling that we did in order to make predictions for pricing the real estate or the vacation rentals that Vacasa managed in its portfolio. From then, I moved to Flux, an early stage startup at the start of 2019, where I created the initial data pipelines and analytics platforms that we ended up using to work in the career mobility space in HR. So again, very similar to kind of where all of you are at, people coming from non-traditional backgrounds or trying to find career paths within their company that wouldn't be fitting along a traditional timeline or a traditional career path. So being able to identify, employees having skills that would translate to different contexts within different departments of an organization. And most recently in November of 2020, I made that transition to work at Instagram. So I've been there, I guess, at this point, about 7 months. And I work with a team called Reels Community, which is interested in problems or topics pertaining to how do you create a community in the short form video space, and through maybe it's product features that we have, or maybe it's the way that people communicate through comments or through replying with Reels. So I, as a data engineer, try to create the data sets and artifacts that are necessary to drive those insights and business intelligence related to validating, whether or not the features we create a sense of community based on whatever that definition may or may not be. But outside of software, why am I maybe interested in the tech interview and the mentorship space? I've got a decades plus background in career development and stakeholder management with an emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Back in my prior career as an attorney, I was the chair and co-chair of a nonprofit organization called the Oregon Minority Lawyers Association, which is interested in increasing diversity of the attorney legal profession. And I also, for a time, worked at the Oregon State Bar, managing its diversity and equity and inclusion programming. So I use that experience in addition to a lot of experience that I've had both as somebody who's been interviewed for countless jobs in law and software, resulting in successful outcomes and not successful outcomes, and at companies of all different types of scales. So I've interviewed for small startups, I've interviewed for tech adjacent companies I've interviewed for, the Googles and Microsofts and now Facebook, as part of my journey of going and being a software engineer and now data engineer. And on the flip side, I've also sat on the other end of the table as an interviewer. I've interviewed college applicants, law school applicants, judicial candidates on the state and federal level, legal internships, and grant applications, and as a software engineer and data science positions. So I like to think that as a result of all of that, in addition to the mentoring work that I do, that I've gotten to get some experience and some anecdotal and personal stories from the people in the industry that I can synthesize into some tips and strategies that I can provide to you today. So what are the tech interview office hours? As I mentioned before, I've been working on this since last October, and it's really been the culmination of me trying to synthesize a lot of the ad hoc mentorships that I've had, that I've been a part of over the last 3 years, into something that's a little bit more programmatic and a little bit more regular. So it started out with these quad weekly lecture and lab series where we deep dive into one of 6 different categories of tech interviews, which we will overview today as part of this presentation, and now has extended to a weekly open hours, which are on Tuesday nights, live recorded on Zoom, and just kind of like an open format for people to come in, just like if you were in a college setting and you just had some question that you wanted to ask about any part of the industry and any part of the interview process, come in and just be able to ask questions and get some support from like-minded individuals and like-situated individuals in the software industry. And we most recently started a bi-weekly book club. The next one is actually tomorrow morning. We started reading this JavaScript tech interview book. And again, this is not recorded, but this is more live and just kind of a way to facilitate a conversation, frank conversation, based off of a book or an article or some other type of discussion topic that we can, have a conversation about. And that could be a technical thing, a professional thing, or a personal anecdote or personal experiences within the industry. And I'll give information at the end of this presentation if you're interested in attending one of these or, seeing it for yourself. As I mentioned in this slide, we record virtually all of this content. So I'll also give a link to all the past videos we've had so far. So that being said, in the limited time that I have with you all today, I want to go through a quick overview of what you can expect if you attend these sessions. I always start out with a primer on what I've identified as the 6 categories of tech interviews that I've observed in the course of being a software engineer and a data engineer. And I don't know if we have the ability to do so, but I'm going to give time at the end of each one of these sections, because they're like one-pagers, for people to ask questions and get some clarification to whatever interests you within these 6 interview types. So the 6 types of interviews that we have are listed here today, right in front of you. They're stack terminology or concept interviews, ownership or retro interviews, data structures and algorithms interviews, product or system design interviews, data engineering or analytics interviews, and deploy an app interviews. And we'll be going through, in this order, each of these types of interviews. You may have been exposed to some of these interviews already. You may be able to intuit, just kind of based off of the name, what kind of interview this is. And you might have opinions about whether or not this is too narrow versus too generalized of a delineation of these interview types. But this is kind of a good first sort of heuristic or division of categories of buckets for us to start talking about and having a conversation about interviews. So first of all, we have stack terminology or concept interviews. Now, what does that mean at the end of the day? You might be familiar with this if you've gone through a boot camp and you've had sort of sessions related to kind of buzzwords or asking about terminology, but it's a Q&A format that doesn't require an interviewee to write code, but instead talk about a language, a CS concept, technology, a best practice. And you'll typically encounter these SDCs during a screener or initial interview with a recruiter. You might get it in a technical screener with a tech lead or a senior software engineer, and you might get it asked sort of in between a larger on-site interview, as maybe you're talking about a product that you worked on or an experience that you've had in the software industry. And the questions can range with sort of very softball-y to sort of more nuanced questions, from how many years of experience do you have in a particular language? Maybe it's a computer science concept that broadly applies in most software contexts, like what is the difference between parallelism versus concurrency? Or it might be framework or technology specific. So if you are kind of person who is interested in a front-end developer position and you work with modern frameworks, you might be asked about what are the different lifecycle methods in React. Each of these slides will have a beginner tip that I present to everybody, just so that you're getting some immediate knowledge. So a lot of this ends up being rote memorization of concepts. So like building either a list of flashcards or building a question bank for yourself is a great way for you to be able to not only ask yourself those questions, but repeatedly ask those questions to yourself, quiz yourself on them, and apply them much in the same way that you use those like word a day calendars to projects you've worked on or other contexts that you're reading about. So for example, if you were learning about interfaces, and interfaces are a type of abstraction that like sets some sort of ground rules with what kinds of functions or functionality that you want to be able to have for a particular class, or like some other type of object and object-oriented programming. Interface is just like you might want to go and look at your C# code and see where you've used an interface before, and kind of like use that and practice using that terminology when you're explaining the project that you've worked on. I also will have a list of some questions in the speaker notes to this slide about various Stack terminology and concept questions. So once you get a copy of this, you can feel free to browse and see kind of what people have been adding to it, and feel free to add to that list yourselves. But before we move on, any questions on Stack terminology or concept questions? I see a beep. Yeah. Do we have a question?
Yeah, I think Douglas Foreman has a question. Go for it, Douglas.
Okay, Chris, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Chris, my question is on this: if you are asked one of these questions, in your opinion, do you think it's best to give a very specific answer to the question that's being asked, or should you expand upon it and show a depth of knowledge with whatever concept? Right.
I think this is a great question. It's a struggle that I think everybody always has. I tend to personally err on the side of giving a succinct answer, but inviting the opportunity to delve deeper. So saying like, if I were to give you a quick definition of parallelism versus concurrency, it's different ways in which you are able to switch between tasks in different contexts. Parallelism meaning that you can have multiple sets of tasks that are executing at the same time, versus concurrency being able to switch between tasks in a sequential order. And then invite the question of like, but if you want me to go into a little bit more detail, happy to talk more about that. And just a kind of a nice segue so that you're not, to the extent that you're getting to the upper limit of what you feel comfortable describing, you put a like your own artificial cap on it, and you kind of just let the interviewer drive that conversation a little bit further.
Unfortunately, I think Douglas might have accidentally left the meeting when trying to remute himself, but I took a note of your answer, and I'm going to let him know.
Great, perfect.
I've done that before, so I know what that's like.
Oh,
he's
Douglas
back.
is back.
Awesome.
Douglas, were you able to hear any part of that response at all, or?
No, that was the worst time for the internet to drop. But
yeah, so quick recap is I err on the side of being succinct, and inviting the interviewer that you can answer in more depth if they want to dive deeper. Great. I'm going to move on, and then again, like we'll give time after each of these slides to kind of like follow up with questions. So the second type of interview is one that I think is most salient to coding bootcamp graduates. It's the ownership or retro interview. So this is a long form discussion where you're asked deep dive into a significant past project, from idea to architecture to implementation. So you might be asked during this interview to draw out that basic high-level architectural workflow or navigate through your code base if you have access to it. It's a personal project, and to describe sort of that functionality and how different components of that code base interact with each other. You might get, in terms of time scale, you might get like a 30-minute version of this during a screener. You might have a 1 hour during an on-site. I definitely had 2 versions of this. I had a conversation about like a 10-minute description of some code that I wrote on GitHub from the Tech Academy. It was a little text adventure thing that led to an on-site where I talked about a different project that I spent like more closer to an hour diagramming sort of all the different components of a web scraper that I created in C# and talking about sort of like what were the pieces that I needed to construct in order to like deploy a job to scrape a page, and how I was like sort of like templating where I was going to find the information that I needed. So, you know, a few example questions that I've listed below. Can you draw out the different components of your web app from the front end to the API to the database? One part of the retro that I hope is a good best practice that you all will learn is tell me a good thing, a bad thing, and a thing you would change, commonly referred to by some engineers as plus minus delta. And then what's the first new feature you want to build to improve a project you've already completed? Like if you were to take, you know, like the next week to go and improve something that you've already done or a presentation or whatever, like what would be that first thing that you would be excited to build? So a beginner's tip associated with this: learn to draw your architecture on paper or using an app like Draw.io or Lucidchart or Google Drawings, and practice describing your app by referring to this visual diagram, pointing it out with a mouse, or, you know, like if you were in person, like being able to point on a whiteboard or some other surface, where these components are and what those relationships between those components are. And I'll give you an example really quickly before I open up for questions. This is a diagram that I gave for a previous presentation at the Tech Academy related to an actual service or feature that I helped build at my last job. But this could apply to basically 99.9% of web apps. So your basic web app is going to have some sort of a front end, a client. So that's represented in the top left. And, you know, like if to the extent that you have to save data, transform data, create data, or delete data, there's going to be a database that, or some sort of a data store that's attached to it. And in order to communicate between that front end, what the changes that you're making in that UI versus how it gets stored, you need some sort of a contract that says you can update it in this way, you can change it in this way versus that way. That's what where the API comes in, is it enforces or limits or provides the functionality for you to make those transactions. Now assume that you have this web app that exists. Maybe it's, you know, like maybe it's a Yelp type app, maybe it's a social media app, and you want to run analytics on it. And the thing is, if you ran a bunch of database queries or, you know, like ran a bunch of transactions on that database, you're also interfering with the day-to-day use of the user to be able to, you know, like update their profile or, you know, make a post. So what do we do? Then, you want to maybe create some sort of a service that copies, that replicates that database into a data warehouse, and actually create your analytics platform to connect directly to that warehouse as opposed to the transactional database. So you can see that within these, you know, these 6 components here, like there's a huge story that you can tell with respect to the functionality of any sort of a web app, as well as the analytics need for you to be able to derive insight, you know, see how many users have been logging into the website in the last 10 days, or finding out what the most popular actions are on your platform. So this is the power of using even a generic diagram like this, which I think I just made this in Google Slides. So this isn't even me using like a dedicated platform designed to make these types of diagrams, but it conveys a story, and that's what's really important. Yeah, so that's ownership or retro interviews. Any questions from, I guess, people who are coding bootcamp students or graduates who are working on these kinds of projects already and need a storytelling device? Well, I think if that in that case, oh, is there somebody?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so we had a question pop up in the chat box, and Ricardo Lopez asked how important are personal projects when interviewing?
To the extent, I will say this, is to the extent that you are a new entry into the software industry, incredibly important from the perspective that you don't have, those years of experience you can point to in prior jobs. So the way that I think about personal projects or even projects that you worked on in a boot camp is that they are sort of that alternative or substitute for real work experience. So being able to, again, synthesize and thoughtfully translate that process of you working on that project within the context of how you would manage a project in a work setting is the evidence that you're going to be able to provide that even without work experience, specifically as a software engineer, that you are thinking about the right questions, that you are organizing your work, and you are thinking about ideal use cases versus practical use cases versus feature development post-launch. And that's your analog to a software engineer who's seasoned in the industry. And then I see another question: how important is the chart notation when drawing them out to illustrate them in interviews? Like some people love having the specific chart notations or whatever. Like at the most, I use a cloud for a cloud service, the cylinder for the database, and then I use squares and diamonds and triangles. Like, I mean, I would say it's not as important to get the specific types of like best practice chart images down, so much as you're able to convey that storyline and actually be able to distinguish that, like the client is different from a database. So like if you had a circle for one thing, but a square for another thing, I think that's just as effective as long as you can maintain that narrative and that storytelling element. But it's kind of fun to learn. But I would say, don't worry about having to learn it in order to be effective in communicating the diagram. Great questions, everybody. We're going to move on to the next type of interview. So the third kind of interview, I think, is the one that I think most people who are entering the software industry, and even most people who are seasoned vets in the software industry, fear the most or have heard the most like horror stories about. And these are the data structures and algorithms interviews. I would say that this also, for those who are coming from non-traditional backgrounds like myself, feel like this was the gatekeeper back, like the excuse as to why I wouldn't make this leap in the first place in the industry, because I didn't have a computer science background and I didn't have the time to study these specific types of algorithmic concepts. So what are they? So, I mean, at the end of the day, they're an interview that tests, computer science concepts through writing and or executing code to perform some discrete task or to implement some algorithmic logic. It requires a strong fundamental knowledge of vanilla coding, so not relying on sort of those helper libraries or quality of life libraries that you might encounter in like Python or JavaScript, for example. An understanding of optimization, which people refer to as Big O, and the ability to plan and communicate your plan to an interviewer. And there's no need to create an app. It's usually pretty discrete functionality. And some example formats of questions that you might get is a single coding challenge over a period of 30 minutes to an hour. So like you might be asked, oh, you're getting this data, maybe it's an array of strings, and I want you to devise an algorithm that allows me to search each of the strings in those arrays for a particular keyword or set of keywords. And if so, replace them with something else. And if they don't exist, then to remove them from the array. That might be some sort of an algorithmic problem that I've just pulled out of my butt, but it probably exists in the universe of algorithms challenges in the world. You might get it more in a rapid fire series of simple algorithm or coding challenges, like on the order of 5 to 10 minutes. You might be asked, for example, how would you reverse a string? Or how would I go and make lowercase to uppercase without using the built-in lowercase uppercase? And then you might have, on the other hand, multiple challenges that build on a single algorithm's problem. So you might have a part 1, part 2, part 3, where part 2 will rely on the completion of some sort of a basic algorithm in part 1, and you're kind of just building incrementally off of that initial algorithm. And the best beginner's tip that I can give for you is to buy an Intro DS and Algorithms book. the one that I always recommend to everybody is Grokking Algorithms. It's written in Python, but it has great illustrations and a human readable set of like descriptions and explanations as to the basic types of algorithms and data structures that you will encounter in these types of interviews. And I would sign up for some sort of a service, whether a free account or a premium account for, like, I use LeetCode personally, but there's many of them. LeetCode and Code Wars are just two of the many options that are available out in the worldwide internet. And I have a list in this slide, in the speaker's note, of a list of questions that I've curated on LeetCode to get it started on. They're all easy problems. They're all available to a free account. So you, to the extent that you aren't committing to a particular service, you can kind of test these out and see what that experience is like. And another huge tip is that time management is a critical element of these interviews. So I would practice not just for completion, but I would practice segmenting your problems into discrete, stages of solving a problem, and just moving on if you've like not met that time limitation. And we'll go into that in one of the case studies that I've set up later on in this interview. Any questions with respect to data structures and algorithms interviews?
Hey, Chris.
Hi.
I've read online from some people who used to be recruiters that a lot of people come into these interviews, especially this kind of interview, sort of assuming that it's all on them. But this person I was reading said that it's really as much a test of your knowledge as it is your collegiality. And so this person suggested like dialogue rather than pontificate, dialogue with the person saying, this is how I would sort of set up the architecture or, the algorithm. Does this make sense to you, rather than feeling it's all on you? Does that resonate with your experience?
1,000,000% this.
Okay.
1,000,000% this. And for two reasons. One, if I'm an interviewer and you're gonna just wrap all your knowledge in your head and only talk at me, like, it's a very awkward experience just as an interviewer. But more importantly, one of the criteria for many of companies that are interviewing and using this type of interview is how well you're able to communicate your thought process, how well you're able to ask for clarification with ambiguity, how well are you with expressing to the interviewer a gap in your knowledge, and to facilitate using the interviewer as a resource. There is a specific criteria that if you are asking the interview for a resource, they will now pay attention to ask to whether or not you took that advice and how you implemented it.
That's a good point.
So I would say dialogue's always a positive thing. Communication's always a positive thing, and you can flip an interview in your favor, even if you don't complete the algorithms challenge. If you are showing that you're partnering up and collaborating with this interviewer and are able to at least conceptually walk through how you're going through things, even if you have maybe only 80% of the code there. It's not a guarantee, but it definitely swings it more heavily in favor of you than if you have not.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks for that.
Mm-hmm. So somebody has an interview with Facebook soon, and we need to study data structures and algorithms. Are there any tips that you have to impress an interviewer? Well, I can't speak specifically about the Facebook process only because I work there, and I haven't been trained to do the interview process from the interviewer's perspective. And I'm sure that there are all sorts of things that I need to sign in advance to talk about the Facebook experience. But generally speaking, if you are working with that type of a interview process, there's going to be stages of interviews. So the screener interviews are going to be more rapid fire based. So you won't necessarily have time to really communicate your thought process. But during the on-sites, if you manage to get past that screener stage, again, being able to convey thoughtfully what your process are, what we talked about earlier with Mark's question about being able to get clarification about whether or not this is an approach that makes sense, or if there are any sort of limitations or restrictions that you need to consider when devising your algorithm. Those are the things that are going to impress an interviewer. And they're not necessarily trying to gotcha. That's not the point, is not to trick an interviewee per se, but it is to kind of like seed that landscape with ambiguities in a way that it's going to force you to ask questions and force you to get clarification. presentation, and give you the opportunity to engage one-on-one with the interviewer. And then I see a question from Ricardo. Does the difficulty of these questions depend on who you're interviewing for? Yes. Some companies will have their own hand-rolled bank of questions, or they'll compile these. Some of them will literally use questions that you'll find on one of these websites. And it really depends also sort of on the seniority of the role that you might have. Like maybe they only care about this as a gatekeeper. So maybe they only care about the fact that you kind of can algorithmically, manipulate a string in a particular way or iterate through to kind of just make sure you're passing the smell test. It really does depend company on company. And again, this is part of the reason why we have this discussion, this larger discussion and presentation about the 6 different types of interviews, is because there's all these different types of interviews across the landscape of company versus company. And so it makes it so that it's much more cumbersome to consistently apply and prepare for these jobs. But as a result, like this is us being able to, also say what are some commonalities, common interview techniques, some strategies, time management stuff that we can implement in order to get our most bang for our buck when we're applying for jobs. Cool. I'm going to move on to the next type of interview, but I'll also reserve time at the very end too for any sort of follow-up or last Q&As, questions. So the next type of interview, if we were talking about ownership and retro interview as a project you've worked on in the past, the product or system design interview is a hypothetical project you're working on in the future. So it's an interview that tests your ability to build a hypothetical product within software or a data storage format with an emphasis on understanding product stakeholders, the user stories to solve through technology, the basic types of software or data convention you need, API endpoints, data models, and how this architecture should scale over time, user base, and usage. So example questions that you'll see in the wild are: build a hypothetical competitor to X company, a competitor to the Yelp.com, but only in the Portland area, or build a competitor to Airbnb or Vacasa. And like but how would you even start framing what information you need in order to build that competition? More discreetly, you might be asked within the context of a specific company, how would you build a service or a microservice to get user feedback on our product? So, so you might have to outline, for example, well, we might want to have some ability to write surveys and to track surveys. So we need a place to store that information. We need some sort of an interface or user interface for people to interact with that. We could get one off the shop, or we can build our own app that specifically does that. There's all these sorts of design questions that are inherent in a question like that. Or alternatively, like creating a system that gets up-to-date real estate market data to help build a predictive model. I must have had my first job on my mind when I was writing the slide a while back. So a beginner's tip for that is to practice for an interview like this. Think of any favorite app that you actually use in real life and try to reverse engineer on a high level the minimum viable product for this app. And this still might seem very vague to people who have not been in this type of interview. So I'm actually going to share a case study that we worked on in a previous session of the Tech Interview Office Hours that is going to be in the speaker notes below. So this was our case study to build a Yelp clone. So I provided a prompt for a competitor to Yelp.com with a list of requirements between lines 1 to lines 29. And I asked that we built the data model and the basic API that drives this MVP. So like create the tables and the schema that would power a database, and sort of what are the fundamental transactions that we would need to support for an app. Not thinking about that UI, UX, just that API side and the database side. And you can see this was all collaboratively done by the people who participated in this case study. So we created a list of tables here: users, restaurants, menus, food types, reviews, owners, verifications. We talked about sort of what would be the right types of data, how we would store it. We created sort of a requirements list for the API. So we thought about the user stories, like what can a non-user do when they're interacting with this clone? We get information about a single restaurant or a list of restaurants. I can sign up for an account, or I can log into my account. And then, what can a non-owner user do and what can an owner do? So these are the kind of 3 different stakeholders that we are kind of envisioning for purposes of this MVP app. And then, you know, at the very end, we tried to write a generic query based off of this data model to be able to see what owner IDs we could get, you know, based off of what data that we filled within these data models that we've created for purposes of this case study. So that's sort of a quick and dirty overview of an actual exercise that we've done in the past at one of these sessions. PK stands for primary key and FK stands for foreign key. So in that relational database structure, so the primary key is that uniquely identifying column or series of columns that denote, you know, like a single type of entity or a single row within the context of the table. And the foreign key is simply that reference to that ID. Great. Moving on, let's see if I can actually pull up my next slide. So the penultimate type of interview, so 5 out of 6, is the data engineering or analytics interviews. And I put this here only because I made the transition, you know, fairly recently within the last couple of years from a full stack engineer to more of a data engineering context. But this type of interview adopts more flavors from multiple kinds of interviews. So it's a hybrid, to say the least. It's an interview that inherits, you know, like could inherit data structures and algorithms interview, product or system design interview, retro interviews, but within the context of the important criteria for a data engineer or an analytics person, which is modeling, storage, transformation, and analysis of big data. So problems are usually framed in terms of ETL, which is extract, transform, and load. So that's the series of backend processes by which you're going to take data from some source, provide some sort of a transformation and manipulation to the type of data, to the cleaned type of data, or the concise or aggregated form of that data that you want, and then load it into your own system. It might involve SQL query construction and optimization. So if I've been given a hypothetical database that has, you know, 3 or 4 tables that have some series of relationships between them, how would I go and make those connections in order to derive insights from those disparate tables? And like data modeling, like we did in that immediate example that I gave you with the case study, consuming data, you know, either in terms of a long chunky process where you're taking a chunk of data and you're processing at a time, or if you're processing incremental pieces of data in real time, and creating metrics that basically stand in for what are our goals for our organization. Are we achieving the milestones that we want? Are we making our performance requirements for how we expect our company to grow month over month, year over year, etc. So yeah, so I mean, I won't belabor the point in terms of the example questions. You can see a few of them below. Beginner's tip for that, there's a great website, PostgreSQL exercises. This is what a great playground that I used actually to study personally for my data engineering position at Facebook. And it's just simply a website that has like a dummy database related to like a country club that has like tennis courts and then members and then guests, and it incrementally asks you to build SQL queries that get information like who's scheduled on tennis court A at, for this week. Yeah, and they'll go through like basic sorts of queries all the way up to like very complex aggregation queries using common table expressions and other types of like nifty tricks that as you become more experienced using database queries, you'll eventually learn. So check out this website. It's super amazing. Any questions with respect to the data engineering or analytics interview?
I have a question.
Sure.
I have 2 questions, actually. First, would you say that this kind of replaces the data structures and algorithms interview if you are looking for more of like a DS or DA, data science or data analytics role, or do they often have to do that algorithms interview as well?
Yeah, so they're blended in. And they can be separate. So in terms of a screener, you might be given purely algorithms questions, but like in terms of an on-site, they might be contextually driven. I need an algorithm, assuming that we have this kind of data, and you're constructing, yeah. So there, it's more blended and contextual than a typical just a data structures and algorithms interview.
And then this might all be on this like PostgreSQL exercises website, but as a data science student, like we did focus more on, I would say, the analytics than the engineering. But I'm very interested in data engineering and not sure how I can practice actually like setting up a database with workflow pipelines and all of that without actually having like company or something to work with.
Yeah. I don't know if they still offer this, for example, but there are a bunch of great open source tools that can, if you just even spin up a database locally, or if you get like a free tier, like on AWS or some sort of a hosting service, there's tools like dbt. What else? Mode is an analytics platform that during the pandemic, they actually allowed free licenses for. You might want to see whether or not they do that. It's an analytics platform that allows you to write SQL queries that connect to your database and then generate reports based off of that. dbt is a tool that allows you to do like save and version control SQL queries that you are going to commonly run for the purposes of deriving analytics and actually materialize them into like views so that you can run them consistently. And it has like cool tools related to building a documentation website with lineage stuff related to all the queries that you wrote within dbt. It's a very powerful tool, open source, great company. I really like them. Yeah, so there are tools that are definitely available. I would say, yeah, for somebody who's starting from a data scientist background and going into more of the data engineering, like the easiest thing you could do at the beginning too would be open up a Jupyter notebook and use some pandas to create some data frames and see if you can pump that into a database and then run queries and analysis based off of that. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of different ways to go. And the questions that you want to be able to solve as a data engineer versus a data scientist are really heavily invested in what can you do regularly, consistently, and optimally. So, like you could find an operation that you're doing in pandas that's, like maybe not leveraging the benefits of using a pandas data frame or using parallelization or something like that. But as a data engineer, you would be interested in how would you split up that work so that you're saving time. And then I see that there's one more question from Ricardo. For somebody who is more interested in database side of programming, is it possible to jump straight into that field rather than starting as a full stack dev and transitioning over? Yeah, I think that's definitely possible. I would say that the benefits of having a full stack engineering position is also that you get contextual knowledge as to why you're transforming data in a particular way. And I'll point out that my first position at Vacasa was a full stack engineering position, but because it was for internal analytical tools, my stakeholders weren't necessarily the Vacasa people visiting the Vacasa website, but it was the analysts within the organization who were going to take our predictions from our predictive model and apply their subject matter domain knowledge to say, this price seems right, or the model didn't predict, this type of event that was going to happen. I need to make adjustments, and being able to help with what are the essential user experiences and user interface components that would make their lives easier. So I think that, yes, I think it is possible to start out with backend positions or positions that are more situated towards the backend, but I also think that there's a great benefit towards having a position that's maybe full stack, but internal tool focused, so that you're kind of limiting your stakeholders, but then leading more into all the components of analysis and analytics. That's just one opinion. Yeah, you're welcome. And finally, deploy and app interviews. So what are these? This is an interview that has a software engineer build a minimum viable product or toy app based on a closed universe of information and a list of requirements. So depending on the time frame, it could be anywhere from an hour to 2 days to a week. These requirements will be more complex, and they'll typically, this is the one type of interview that will typically require you to have both like a strong working knowledge and strong opinions, or relatively strong opinions, about a go-to library, framework, or series of libraries or frameworks in web app development, only because you have to spin up an app in a time-limited period. So like you need to have a toolbox for you to do all these different components. You have to have something to show for it at the end of the day. So you might be asked to create a simple app that displays daily weather data as a time series graph, or create a game like a rock, paper, scissors that can be played against a computer, or create a app that displays image data from an API in a responsive format. So like a popular example that I've seen in other coding boot camps is like, or even in interviews, is leveraging like there's a cats API, a free cats API that like gives you images of cats based off of their breed, and like hooking that up so that you have search capability to that as a UI element, and then like a gallery view. That might be something that might be asked of you as a potential app project. And I have, as a beginner's tip, I would say you need to build some muscle memory in practicing deploying just the sort of hello world or very basic components, so that you're worried more about the design of how these components interact with each other than having to remember, okay, like I need to run these commands in order to spin up my app, or to have like a series of very basic libraries that you want at your disposal. So if you know that you're going to apply for a company that's really involved in analytics and they want somebody to build an analytics platform, you might want to pick up a visualization library like a Chart.js or Victory, so that you can talk about what types of options there are in terms of building a visualization or a chart, or even actually create one, like in real time. And we, at least in when I was at Vacasa and we were interviewing for junior engineers, we had like deploy an app style interviews like that.
All right, looks like Chris froze up there. Little technical difficulties, we'll get it worked out.
I'll go ahead and send him a little text message.
Yeah, do that. Just have him sign out and sign back in. And we do apologize to all. We will have Chris back as soon as possible. Were you able to get through to Chris, Kenzie?
I sent him a message. Oh, he said his internet just died and he's trying valiantly to restart it. So we might need to hang tight for a minute. I don't know if anyone has actually started interviewing at companies and has any stories they want to share about interviews, or we can definitely learn from each other as well.
Or tips, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I can juggle.
Please, Kenzie, yes.
Here we go. All right, let's see. Not very good, but I can do it.
This is Kenzie's previous career.
That's pretty legit. It's better than I can do.
I learned a really hard one recently. I can do it. And Briar
Okay,
just
that
logged
was
off.
pretty cool.
Let's see. This is why I'm still taking classes.
Thanks, Kenzie.
Welcome.
Well, we do apologize, everyone. It was definitely a great tech talk, and we're giving Chris a few more moments. Hopefully, we can get him back on here.
He said it looks like things are starting to spin back up, and he'll try and re-enter now. And if anyone has to leave right at the top of the hour, don't forget we'll post it on the YouTube channel, so you don't have to miss anything. You can email me questions or post them in the chat box. I'm more than happy to ask them for you if you got to go. Welcome back, Chris.
Chris is
Thank
back.
you. All right. Sorry, like I had a critical failure of all of my internet. My kid was all like, "Oh, the internet's slow." I was like, "The internet's not slow. It's dead. It's dead internet." But glad that I can be back on right now.
I'm sure it was Dad's fault, right?
It's totally my fault, hogging all the bandwidth today for this presentation. All right, so where did we leave off here? So I think we were giving some examples of just like use case, like having a beginner's tips, right? Like what kind of library you want to have on the back of your hand. Actually, let me go and before I do this, I want to go back into present mode, presenter view. Let's go up now. Yeah, so to give an example of, I'll give an example in our speaker's notes of a project that I worked on for one of these, one of our past sessions. Let me share this tab instead. So this is a GitHub repo that I wrote for a.
I may be frozen now.
Uh-oh. I can hear you. So there we go. So yeah, so this is, so if you can see my screen right now, it should be pointing to a GitHub repo that I created for a DICE app. So feel free to take a look and see kind of what these are. Like you can see these requirements, and basically I tried to complete as much of this as I could within an hour. And you can see that I have these multiple branches that you can walk through if you want to fork this repo to see kind of like what I did when I coded and I roadmapped versus adding sort of quality of life improvements to this app. Just kind of like, and again, these will be in the slides. And then I'll have another example of a similar deploy an app style interview that I asked some participants in a previous lecture to work on in a mock interview format. But that's typically what you would get is you would get maybe some sort of a repo with instructions that would say like, hey, have this functionality. These are the core functionalities that I want you to have versus this is the plus ones that I want for you to be able to accomplish. All right, so any questions related to deploying app interviews?
Chris, my question is this the sort of thing that people starting out, like junior developers, are commonly going to get asked, or is it purely based on the kind of position and experience you have?
Well, I primarily work now with junior engineers, and so I will say that they are healthily getting these types of assignments or these types of interviews, and they're usually like take home.
I see.
Yeah, so like or like anywhere from a 4-hour to like a 48-hour. So I've definitely worked with students specifically to prep for this kind of an interview. So it is something that has happened, although I think there's still like a favoring right now of data structures and algorithms interviews, but I would say that this is a very popular one as well.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In the interest of time, I'm trying to think about where I can sort of optimize for the rest of our time here. Because we just, the remaining part of this presentation is really sort of, I have a sample case study and a sort of sample lab, so you can kind of see what it looks like if you were to sit in on one of these lectures. So the sample case study, I'll just walk through really quickly. It was kind of like us practicing this 4-part structure for data structures and algorithms interviews. And so I have a 4-part structure that I proffer as sort of like a guideline You're not required to strictly adhere to it, but I think it gives you a great sort of division of labor in terms of time management. And they're really focused around scope, roadmap, code, and retro. So scope meaning if we go into this hypothetical problem which exists on LeetCode, it's available to a free account. What is the algorithm that we're trying to build? What are the key facts and conditions based off of this prompt? What ambiguities need clarity? Do I need to consider big O? So this is your first big opportunity to ask questions of the interviewer, to start that collaborative process. Like, am I off in assuming that I need to worry about, an array of large strings, or do I have to just, am I worried about an array that has at most like 25 strings in it? Getting that sort of information would be very helpful. And so here are some example questions that I would ask in order to clarify scope. So again, how many words should I expect? How many letters should I expect in this hypothetical exercise where they're asking you to take an alien language that has a different alphabetical order than English and check and see whether or not the array of words that are being presented to you are sorted in that order. So we know that our inputs are going to be an array of these words and then this hypothetical ordering of this alien language, and our output is going to be a Boolean. It's going to be either a true or a false, whether or not it satisfies this condition or not. You might want to ask, do I need to worry about saving a whole ton of variables or not? Or can I just, in the messiest brute force way possible, solve it as long as I get a result? You might have questions related to what happens if words are part of words. So if I have the word, frank and the word frankly, how would those be ordered? Because one is completely a subset of the other, a prefix of the other. How would I handle if I had dirty data? If they're saying I'm having to order this in terms of lowercase letters, what happens if I have a capital letter? What happens if I have a number passed in? What happens if I have a null passed in? Should I be able to defensively accommodate for that? So that's the kind of questions that you want to ask typically at the very start of your interview process before you even start writing any piece of code or even road mapping. Then you move on to this road mapping stage where what are the big picture steps we need to do? Can I discuss this conceptually without using code? Think about if you were to teach somebody how to go and bake a cake, not expecting that they were going to go and literally take every one of your instructions and just do that. If you're at a high level, describe, well, I need some flour and I need some sugar and I need some flavoring and eggs and fat. I need to be able to mix wet ingredients and dry ingredients separately and then incorporate them together. I need to have an oven that's preheated and I need to have a pan to put the wet cake in. I need to bake it for a certain amount of time. I need to then take it out, make sure I have something to be able to take that out, let it cool, and then have a knife to go and take it out of the pan and, and whatever, ice it or decorate it however you want. So again, what is that human readable? And I would encourage you to not use for loops or coding or references to specific coding syntax in here because you want to keep it human readable and you don't want to inadvertently opinionate yourself in the process of writing this high level instruction because you want to have options available to you until you're ready to commit to code. Then of course you have the actual coding part. Can I translate my big picture to specific code? Can I switch work to different parts of the roadmap? How do I refactor when I see an edge case? So in this case, we literally take this roadmap, this human readable set of instructions that we've written in the code in comments, and we compartmentalize and modularize where we're going to tactically answer part of that algorithm. So if we know that we have to iterate, across all words, we know we need a for loop. So we're going to put the for loop underneath the part that says we're going to go and compare against each of these series of pairs of words within this array of words. And then finally, when we talk about retro, does my algorithm execute and return a result? Have I covered all of my edge cases? How does my algorithm perform and what can I improve? So this is where we want to talk about big O in terms of time and memory performance. What are some of the pros and cons about the approach that we took? Are we forcing ourselves to, in an exponential situation, that if I increase that array of words, that it's going to exponentially increase the amount of work that I want? Or is it going to just linearly increase it? Are there any edge cases that you failed to consider? And an interviewer might say, what happens if you have this kind of a word or these pairs of words? What happens then? Or they might say, well, okay, what happens if I change some of the initial input conditions for this problem. And you don't have to necessarily rewrite the code to change it. You just have to have a conversation about what that is. And so again, I want to impress upon y'all that when you're studying for code challenges, data structures and algorithms interviews, or even deploying app interviews, that you stick to sort of a format and you practice a time-limited framework. So as you say, give yourself 60 minutes to solve a problem. Say that I should spend maybe 5 to 10 minutes on scoping, for example, 10 to 15 minutes on retro, 25 to 30 minutes on coding, and then 5 to 10 minutes, on retro, sorry, road mapping. So like whatever that 4-part structure is, set it up for yourself and immediately time yourself. And when you pass that timer, just move on to the next part, because what you want to do is you want to be able to have an appreciation of what the sense of time it takes for you to plan to execution to discussion. And so if you're only focusing on blending all of those things together in this one blob of work, where you're just, I'm talking and communicating and writing code and refactoring code and communicating about what the performance is all at once, you'll not be able to really consistently or optimally be able to answer problems like this. It will feel like a slog, or you'll feel that, or what you'll find out is at the end of the day, there'll be these sorts of gaps in terms of what are the benchmarks that an interviewer is looking at when they're evaluating your performance for this type of an interview. And it looks like we have a question from Eric. Based on my experience thus far, there seems to be a need for artistic or creative in terms of developing the aesthetic aspects of a web page. Do I have any tips for developing this skill set? I mean, yes and no. This is probably the area that I'm weakest in, but I know, for example, that if you're going to be more on that front end side, definitely you should be looking into building a lot of expertise in a modern framework. So like maybe it's like Vue, maybe it's React, maybe it's Angular. You want to get deep into the weeds, I think, a little bit on CSS styling and sort of the best practices around there. Like Sass is a popular one, for example, but even understanding and appreciating what CSS does. And I'll see if I can find a link to a recent article I read about in terms of the value of CSS. Understanding that, understanding why things are in a grid, what margins and paddings are, like those like design decisions are going to be very important. And if you're more strictly UI or UX, there are tools like Figma, for example, that are purely based around that visual design component, where there, as an output of you designing it, you'd be able to export things like the CSS styles for the different components that you're envisioning for your UI UX. Best resource to learn data structures and algorithms for beginners, I would say Grokking Algorithms. And right now, let me see if I have a copy of the book really quickly. If you are going the Python route, and Python's the primary language you want to use, I would say Elements of Programming Interviews is a book that I used to study for data structures and algorithms problems, and then using Elite Code. Because you can do it in multiple languages, so there's a lot of flexibility there. I am, in terms of the book club that we're doing tomorrow, we are reading through Learning JavaScript Data Structures and Algorithms from Loyan Groner. It's this book right here, 3rd edition. Right now, and basically the way that it's structured is every chapter refers to a particular data structure or a particular algorithm type, and like it gives examples of ways to build it, gives hypothetical use cases as to why you would use those data structures. So those are just 2 examples. Another type of book that I think that people seem to use a lot is Cracking the Coding Interview. That's another great book if you want to use that as a resource. But I can't personally vouch for that. I could, maybe in a few weeks, I can vouch a little bit more specifically for the JavaScript book that I just pointed out. Oh, yeah, the title of the Python book is Elements of Programming Interviews. And I'll put it in the comments as well. Elements. I
got it, Chris.
Got it. Great. Awesome. Okay, so I know we're a little bit over, but if people want to bear with me, I've got maybe a cool 5-minute demo, and then we can ask questions to make up for the lost time of me being blinked off the face of the internet. So the second part of our quad weekly structure is we have a sample lab, which is basically, again, like a mock interview that we try to keep pretty close to an actual interview format and structure so that people can feel the tenseness or the nervousness of going through that process. In this case, we had a deploy an app interview. This was 2 sessions ago, so 2 months ago, creating a game in React in 1 hour. So basically what I did was I gave the option of one of 3 apps. So tic-tac-toe, which is actually the tutorial that they give you in the React website, but not using any of the instructions there and just coding it live. The game of concentration, which is, you have a grid of 4x4 cards and you're flipping 2 cards at a time to find out if you have matching pairs. So creating that functionality. And high-low, which is, basically there should be 52 cards. You reveal a card, you guess whether or not it's high or low, and you point appropriately. So I gave a list of requirements and a list of nice to haves. I asked for the person that I was mock interviewing to apply scope, roadmap, code, and retro in terms of structuring their time and to figure out how to plan through the creation of the app in React. And to show that I'm absolutely fair about this, I actually went through this exercise myself. So I recorded myself taking exactly 1 hour to do as much as I can for the concentration game, app 2. So you can see, there's a link to the video here. And then afterwards, I spent a little bit more time, maybe another hour or 2 to kind of give a final demo of the app, which looks like this. This is a video of kind of what that concentration app looks like. Very simple. I mean, literally, this is definitely done, I think, within less than 3 hours. So you can see that it does all the basic functionality. It obscures letters. It will flip letters back and hide them again if they don't match, and it'll keep them revealed if they do match. And of course, at the very end, if you get to the win state, you get a little "you won" message. And that was all done in React. And I'll be honest, I'm not a front-end person. I started learning React, actually learning React, maybe just a few months ago. So this is something that, again, if you are feeling that, oh, I need to have a background in React in order to be able to even try or attempt this exercise, don't feel afraid to do. Just go. I would say go through that React tutorial, build that tic-tac-toe app for yourself. Play around with, read a couple of articles, and just go for it. And the point is, if you look at the GitHub repo that I've linked in the slides, I have a branch just for the 1 hour time that I took. And I have a separate branch afterwards to show what would I do if I were to polish everything off and just kind of get it done to a state that I could be proud of to present for an interview or for something. And so take a look at the video. You can see parts where I thought I had it right and parts that I didn't know what I had to do. And you can see that everybody goes through this process. It's not just going to be you. Let's see. We do have a question going back to data engineering. As a data engineer, do I need to be a database developer? Not at Facebook. Not necessarily at Facebook. I mean, I have to create tables and that sort of thing, but I don't need to be a database administrator. Maybe that's the question that is being asked here. But at my last job at the early stage startup, I definitely was required to create the databases, figure out replication schema for that, or replication, whatever the cadence for that was, building schemas and all sorts of stuff, and access rules around data warehousing and analytics. So I did the whole gamut with respect to that. Great, lots of questions coming out. But in that case, let's fast forward really quick. So we have, how do I sign up? If you're interested in attending, send me an email. This is my email. Kenzie will give slides and should have the email with the subject title, Tech Interviews Office Hours. I'll give you some calendar invites. Attend or watch one of my intro presentations. This is one of them. So you've already satisfied that requirement, and read and adhere to the professional code in the notes below. And that's for me to be able to ensure that we're approaching this from the perspective of sort of vulnerability and humility, so that we can be really honest and thoughtful and empathetic towards each other when we're saying, I don't understand what's going on. I need some help here. It's really meant to be sort of a brain trust or a collaborative exercise. But going to just Q&A, I'm happy to answer any questions here. I'm going to start with the question, the last question that was asked in chat, but then happy to open the floor up for another 15 minutes or so to kind of just wrap it up at 2:30 with questions. But what programming language do I primarily use? Judging by some of the examples, I'm guessing JavaScript. Actually wrong. I primarily use Python. But I've been using JavaScript because the coding bootcamp that I work with, they're JavaScript developers. So that I actually had to learn. That's why I learned. Part of the reason why I learned React was because I needed to learn how to actually communicate, how to do things, as opposed to just evaluate or review other people's projects. Because, you know, with my level of experience as a mid-level engineer, I can infer or intuit kind of what the functionality of code in React is, but I really needed to get that nitty-gritty understanding of how these pieces work together for me to really appreciate that. I've also worked in my first job at Picasa, primarily in PHP, which is a language I didn't learn at the Tech Academy. I learned it all on the job. I learned all of my Java, or most of my JavaScript, vanilla JavaScript stuff at my second job, which was 50% Python for the back-end data science related stuff, and JavaScript for front-end API stuff in like Node, and we used Vue. And at Facebook, I used Hack, which is a flavor of PHP. I used Python, both in terms of ETL processes and some templating. I use a lot of SQL because I'm generating queries. And then, you know, like I've played around, not for work purposes, but for like, we have like hackathons within the company. So I've explored a little bit like Objective-C and some of the code base related to like mobile stuff over there. I would say I'm very terrible and don't know anything about that. But yeah, like there are opportunities to learn different types of languages within each of the company contexts that you're at. Okay, so sir, can I place email in the chat pod? I can definitely do that. All right, but any other questions on the fly? Feel free to unmute yourself or to ask in chat. I'll give you a solid 15 minutes to kind of like back and forth, and we'll see where we go. Joseph raised their hand. Joseph.
Hey there, Chris. I have a quick question.
Sure.
Regarding professional experience. So I don't have any real like professional experience other than, you know, like kind of casual jobs like at a sushi place. And I also don't have any like experience in a technical industry. Like I haven't gone to college or anything. Is that going to be a hurdle that I need to overcome, or is that something I should kind of put in the rear view a little bit? I've been kind of worrying about that lately. Thank you.
Absolutely. And Joseph, I would say, like realistically speaking, yes, you will encounter some sort of a hurdle, but it's not an insurmountable one. Most of the people that I work with, because I primarily work with coding bootcamp graduates, are people coming from blue-collar, non-traditional backgrounds, I've worked with auto mechanics, I've worked with people who've worked in the music industry, who've worked with servers, and being able to translate and actually relate what that analog in the software engineering industry to their past careers and the value that you got from those past experiences is super important too. I had a mentee for a number of years, one of the first mentees I had, who also didn't graduate from college and was worried about very much the same thing, and had, you know, didn't have necessarily the fastest start after finishing up a boot camp and looking for jobs. He had a few contract jobs and a few jobs, but now he's working at Goldman Sachs, you know, like, and this is like a year and a half out from him graduating from his boot camp. And again, like, did not have a college degree, you know, like was one of those things where he worried about it. And what I think the journey is, and it'll be difficult to sort of like believe and take faith in it, honestly. And so is that as you start working more and developing more and finding your voice in how to communicate and convey what you've done in software, whether it's personal projects or through the coding bootcamp, you'll find that those are going to be the most important things. And the fact that you worked in prior jobs that involve a lot of people and involve some level of planning about something is important, because relationships and deadlines matter. So for those of you coming from like a for a previous career, you know, like, and don't poo-poo your past experience. Try to really glean what are the things that are benefiting you because of the years of work experience that you had. Honestly, like, I've had a very privileged background. I didn't have a tech background. I had a science background and went into law. And so like from that perspective, I was very highly educated. So, I mean, take what I say with a grain of salt. But one of the biggest realizations I made when I made the transition to software was how much of the analytical process of organization and defining things and contracts and relationships between you in the computer and writing software was very much like writing contracts as a lawyer, except I got to see all the contracts execute and be evaluated in like real time, as opposed to going through a court system in 2 years and arguing and litigating over what this means or what that means. but because I was able to make that relationship, I would go to interviews and people were like, oh, you were a lawyer. That's a huge leap. That doesn't make any sense at all. But I could create and construct a narrative that showed how I carried over those skill sets from that prior career to this one. And again, an exercise that I ask coding bootcamp graduates to do is think about their past careers, no matter how disparate they are, and try to find a way that you would communicate what you did in that past job using the parlance and lingo and terminology and patterns that you're starting to learn through your software career, and see if there's something that you can workshop there. If not, if you're still struggling with that, let's set up a one-on-one, let's chat. Happy to kind of like walk through it and kind of workshop on something like that together. It's a real passion of mine to be able to make sure that everybody's story's being heard with respect to coming into this industry, because it is, for the longest time, been very gate-kept by economics and particular types of education. So like my goal here, again, is to make sure that the software community continues to look and represent more of what people are in communities. And you know, like, and so like, yeah, like if you feel like you're still struggling with that, send me an email, let's set up a coffee and let's talk about it. Let's see, Eamon, is that right? Eamon wrote, do you find the junior developers you work alongside suffer from imposter syndrome? If so, how often do you find that? I'm in my 4th year of engineering and I have the hugest effing imposter syndrome. I have worked with 2 friends, close friends of mine, who have made the transition from marketing manager and a lawyer to software engineering and have seen that imposter syndrome. Yes, it completely exists. It's a huge facet of the industry. It sucks. And this is part of the reason why I wanted to construct these office hours, just to have a space where we can just be like, yeah, we all feel like imposters, because we clearly recognize there are things that we want to learn and we don't know yet, but we want to be able to learn these things. And say, how often do I find it? I find it all the time. I actually worry about, on some level, people who are so extremely confident that they have no doubts about what their capabilities are. Not because I think that I'm so much better or that there's so much necessarily room to grow, but because I think that there's, on some level, the extreme part of confidence, which is you haven't really had the time to self-reflect or to think about with empathy, maybe what the user's case is when you implement a feature, or the product use case for why we think we want to push this part of the app. There's a lot of human involvement. Because I worked as an attorney and in litigation, with like family-related litigation, I like to think about things from the perspective of the client, the perspective of the user, very user-centric design, and building empathy about like, okay, like I might think it's completely convenient for me to work in this manner, but is this something that my successors are going to be able to understand if I wrote my code this way? Or is this a feature that I'm telling users, oh, it's tough, you're gonna have to learn how to do this? Or am I gonna really be responsive to how people actually interact with the products that you are creating for other people? I mean, because that's what you're doing with software. You're creating something to be to be used, to be of service to other people, whether it's abstractly, business to business, or internally, or if it's directly, if you're working at a Facebook and you're running a social media app. So yes, long story short, everybody suffers from imposter syndrome. We need to have more conversations about why we need to recognize imposter syndrome and what that means and how we can be more supportive in that regard.
So Chris, really good talk, really informative, really good to see you. Question I have is, for someone who's just graduating the boot camp or someone new to the industry, what are the best tips that you have for being able to present in a tech interview? So obviously practice is good, but what are some of the best tips you have for that?
So err on the side of being succinct and err on the side of taking your time. I think there's an overwhelming urge to want to prove yourself because you're coming from this scrappy background, right? Like you didn't go to a 4-year college to get this knowledge. You don't know all the algorithms like Dijkstra or whatever, pathfinding. You don't know traveling salesman problem. You don't know any of these things, and you're kind of learning them on the fly. And so we feel the need to impress others. I think the way that you impress others is by really thinking about what is the work that you've done. How can you synthesize that into a compelling story? And how to relate to the needs of the company or companies that you're applying to, and just making connections and meeting people. I know people are like, talk about that networking game. Lawyer, networked. I've been a terrible networker. I'm a much better networker now. And the ROI on networking, if you were to say like, oh, this networking opportunity led to this job, ROI is going to be really low. I'm going to be very honest about that. But if you're approaching networking from, I need to get a job, and so I